Good to see everyone here. Thanks so much. I'm Brian Weiser, Madison Wall. Many of you will remember me from many different things I've done as an analyst, as an industry person. So I was commissioned by Sim a couple months ago to outline the future of currencies and measurement and trading. And to get there, I needed to help articulate a view about how the overall industry for the U.S. national television market would evolve first and foremost. So building on work that I've done over decades and supplemented with conversations with probably some of you in the room, I can't see, and others who are very much focused on this space, we've developed what will be a paper, some sort that will make its way into the public domain before long. So before that, what we're doing is we're going to talk about some of these issues. Now, there's a whole history of my take of why the industry has evolved as it has that I think it's important to have a common understanding. We'll get into that in the paper, but for immediate purposes, what I want to talk about is the drivers of change for the overall industry. If we have a common view about where the industry is going to go, there are certain things we're somewhat certain about. There's some things we're a little less certain about. Then we can start to talk about what the consequences are on trading currencies and measurement. Because if we don't have a clear view about how the industry is going to look over the course of the next decade, then it's really kind of a moot point to even start talking about these three things. All right, so loosely speaking, we could bucket the industry into different sectors that have lots of overlapping interests and trends that impact all of them. And again, don't need to read this. This does highlight about 17 major drivers of change that I expect are going to impact the future of the industry. And I can say that these 17 or so issues are fairly certain to play out in one form or another. Again, if we have some confidence about how these issues play out, then we will have at least a better starting point to talk about trading currencies and measurement. All right, so the first thing, cord cutting, probably not a shocker. It's bad and getting worse. We start with the presumption that high single-digit declines are the norm going forward. I don't see anything getting in the way of that. We're at a point where about half the U.S. population will have pay TV, including vMVPDs, by the end of next year. And we'll be down to a third within a few years of that. Consolidation, it's inevitable. In what form exactly it will take, hard to say. Just talking in the green room a bit about whether or not, this will actually be allowed by regulators. I think that when an industry finds itself in a struggling place, and many of these companies will, because of the cord cutting issue in particular, which is going to meaningfully impact really important revenue streams, and the shift to streaming, which will only lead to less profitable overall businesses, I think it's kind of inevitable. Now, it could be that consolidation takes shape, including players other than these. But I think it's safe to say that today's 5 in this group becomes 3. John McCain's dream came true in a different form. If you remember back 20 years ago, when he was the chairman of the Commerce Energy Committee, I think it was, he was the most vocal advocate for a la carte. And I was a cable analyst at the time, and I think anyone else who looked at the business would have said, that's really going to be damaging for the industry. I mean, there's plenty of reasons to let people feel like they've got choice, but they're going to pay more. They're going to be less exposed to a wider variety of content. But hey, if that's what politicians want, good for them. Well, guess what? We're here now. The a la carte bundles just look a little different. They come in the form of these $20 monthly subscriptions. But critically, you can get out of those subscriptions very easily. And so again, this is John McCain's dream come true. Content spending. There is no way spending doesn't continue to prioritize streaming services going forward. And so even if cost discipline continues to hold for the biggest owners of studios and streaming services, they're not reinvesting in the linear services. They're just not. So if all the spending continues to go towards streaming services, that has implications as well. Consumers don't like ads for the most part. I really don't buy this idea that, oh, well, if they're well targeted. No. I think mostly people don't like them. They tolerate them. And in certain kinds of programming, consumers will tolerate ads more than in other environments. Sports, maybe, get to that in a minute. But in an on-demand world, the ability to sell ads is going to be, or to have a high ad load is really low. In addition, I would argue, this is conjecture, that the services that consumers most want and most consume, those are the services they'll probably pay the most to get away from ads. So Netflix probably never gets above a very small threshold of ad-supported subscribers. People will say in response, oh, but wait, consumers won't be able to afford it. Actually, there's currently about $100 billion they're spending today on their legacy pay TV services and only $30 billion on streaming. So actually they can. And guess what happens when you get price rises on streaming services? It contributes to the accelerated decline of traditional pay TV. Sports has been this thing that people have held up as the great salvation for advertising because it's still the broadest reaching content. That's great as long as people have access to content. As sports services become a la carte, that goes away. As people stop accessing linear pay TV services because they've cut the cord, random sports viewing kind of goes away. And so the casual fans stop watching. All of this we'll get to in a minute. Fragmentation continues. Was this the most popular show last year? And the rating was, who knows the number, like a 1? I mean, like literally this was the top of Nielsen's programs, I think, for last year. Okay, so we all know this, there is no wide-reaching individual property. All of these prior trends that I just mentioned will lead to something that looks like this when it comes to reach. So when it comes to the premise that television satisfies reach goals, it's going to be really hard. Social video becomes a place where marketers could reach consumers with video. But a separate issue is that the kinds of advertisers that are emerging really want to do different things. Creative destruction is the idea that new businesses evolve and emerge, replacing other businesses that go away. Think of e-commerce, right? The very fact that you have, say, 20% of retail sales coming through e-commerce channels rather than through retail channels, they've got very different needs for advertising. They're going to look at the world very differently. And again, creative destruction is an ongoing process. This photo is Joseph Schumpeter came up with the concept. Okay, we know that outcomes are only going to be more important for many kinds of marketers, especially many of the newer marketers that have come into existence. It's certainly everything that everyone talks about. Use some more first-party data. We can be fairly confident that wherever you can get it, you'll use it. All of this leads to a shift of media mixes. So television in particular continues to lose share as digital advertising continues to grow. Now, some would say, but wait, can't television solve a lot of these problems and hold up reasonably well because of addressability? You remember the whole selling dog food ads, selling dog food to dog owners? Well, I'm sure someone wants to sell dog food to dogs. The problem is there are other better ways to accomplish addressability for most kinds of advertisers. And this little thing called the interwebs seems to work pretty well. So I'm really doubtful about that. At the same time, privacy, like the internet knows your dog. That was where I was getting this from. Privacy concerns will only become more important. So there will be some restrictions on data. Again, to the things that we know and we can say with some confidence will happen. Cost controls. And this is really important when we think about the future of all of this stuff. Cost controls are only going to continue to hold up. Marketers, agencies do not want to spend more money if they can avoid it on anything, right? And that is a really important point we'll come back to. And the fact that, the industry does kind of look like a Rube Goldberg machine sometimes does contribute to slow change, whatever that change is. It's a complex industry. There's many moving parts, many different stakeholders, and not everyone moves at the same time in the same way. And so slow pace of change, we can be pretty certain about that. All right, now here's where we start to get kind of interesting. And I can be a little bit more doubtful about exactly how the world's going to evolve. I can think of 3 different paradigms that marketers will use to manage their budgets in the future. First one is the idea of video being more or less as it is today. So television, linear TV plus CTV. And basically marketers decide this is the line item on a media plan that we're going to optimize, right? That's kind of what everyone does today. It's entirely plausible that that just continues into the future. The medium basically declines because there's less spending from legacy advertisers who have alternatives. It's less effective from a reach perspective. And that creative destruction argument basically means you don't have as many new advertisers showing up who rely on TV, and it kind of is what it is. So it's the same thing, just evolving very slowly. A second paradigm, as I'd characterize it, is the idea that, well, maybe there will be marketers who will think of TikTok and YouTube as being part of the same medium. And to be clear, I'm talking about YouTube, the television tab. I would argue if I were, let's just say, a seller of TV advertising, this would actually be a good thing. On the one hand, it introduces more competition, because if you're a seller of TV advertising, you don't want to include TikTok in your same universe if you can avoid it. I would argue you'd rather have a smaller share of a bigger and still growing pool of inventory than a stable or growing share of a shrinking pool of inventory. I think there will be some marketers who will choose to look at the world this way. I think it's entirely possible that some network owners, media owners may choose to look at the world this way too. It's possible some planners will start to think about their media plans in this way. These are really important points when it comes to, again, trading currencies and measurement. The last one is the example NBC unified, the idea of the common universal ID. I think we've seen from lots of interest in this concept of a single ID that you could use to reach audiences across different kinds of media and different platforms. Right now, I think, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, the NBC ID could be used to buy against, say, Apple News inventory, for example. What I'm suggesting here is much bigger than this. The idea that maybe it's like there's a common ID for Pinterest and Paramount, or Fox, Fox News and Snap, or something. There's something to this idea that the mid-sized social platforms are going to realize at some point that they can't grow by double digits for very long from here. And there are going to be mid-sized players. And TV networks, as I mentioned earlier, are in a difficult position because of cord cutting and because of weak trends for advertising and television as we've historically known it. I'm not saying this is the path. I'm suggesting it's a possible path forward. But whatever these paradigms for planning and however they evolve will go a long way to outlining how trading currencies and measurement will evolve. All right, so now we get to, if we start with the premise that everything I've said up till now is incredibly likely to play out. If we agree that that stuff we can be somewhat certain about, now we can start to look at what are the factors that will influence trading currencies and measurement. So when it comes to trading, from all the years I've spent, certainly in agencies and paying close attention to the industry, the only thing that changes trading is, does someone have a credible ability to walk away from a negotiation? Typically, the answer is no. All right, so when it comes to television advertising today, and here I'm not saying just P&G and Unilever, they're just representing all advertisers here. I will argue that as long as planning and buying are separate, sellers will generally have more leverage. Because once a budget has been allocated to be spent, it's just a question of where it's going to be spent within a certain subset of media owners. And again, I've seen this firsthand. The sellers know that that money is going to get spent. And you know, relatively speaking, whether you're relatively well-positioned or not to get the lion's share of the money or to get a disproportionate share of the money. And it's all about margins in terms of whether or not you get all the money you expect or don't get the money you expect. So the separation of planning and buying, and there's plenty of reasons to believe that that will continue for many marketers, would definitely give leverage to the sellers. On the other hand, you go back to this idea that maybe some marketers will start to think very differently about what the universe of video is. So imagine a world where, in fact, TikTok was managed as part of the TV budget. By the way, TikTok might very well get banned, so it might not be the right example, but anyone providing a lot of video inventory. Imagine if a marketer said, we're going to figure out a process by which we're going to optimize a budget that includes video in all these different places. Yes, Cat on Skateboard is not the same as, top tier professionally produced content. But if you squint, it's similar enough, right? Sight, sound, and motion to a consumer. They think it's all the same. It's an enjoyable experience of consuming content. Okay, there are plenty of reasons why one could make the case that it is similar. So if you had a world where marketers said, yeah, we're going to include a broader array of sellers of video inventory as part of a pool of video, you've changed the negotiating dynamic in a pretty meaningful way from a marketer's perspective. And that would put the leverage on the side of marketers. On balance, I think it's going to be pretty even. So whether or not you believe that one side or the other has more leverage in the years ahead, again, I'm saying in a world where TV advertising declines for all the reasons I've just mentioned, it's not that the sellers lose leverage for many, but for some, in some cases, they will. It's balance is what I'm saying. So if you see that playing out, incrementalism is the most likely path forward for every passing year. All right, so when we think about what gets measured and the future of measurement, well, it really depends on what exactly we're trading, right? And it depends on what marketers want to actually measure, whatever their business goals are. And this is something that can evolve. Like right now, we're talking about outcomes. And at some point, I think it's very realistic that we'll say, well, maybe the way we're thinking about outcomes is kind of flawed, or maybe not. Maybe we need to rethink what it is that we want to measure. This is something that we should be very uncertain about when we're looking at 10 years. But if we have a view about what needs to get measured, or about what the business goals are, then we'll have a clearer view about what gets measured. But I will argue that what will get measured really will depend heavily on where the money goes. And as I've said before, marketers don't want to spend money on measurement. And, we've had this, certainly one of the interesting points that came out of the conversations we had in the leading to the production of the paper was the idea that, and Broad, maybe you could hit on this later, but it was this idea of, in ad serving, the costs for measurement get passed along to the marketer. Well, that's possible that's what happens in this world, that more costs get passed along to marketers. It's also possible that marketers say, we don't want to incur any more costs. We want it bundled with media. We want the media owner to pay for this cost. But if the marketer is supposed to find something really bespoke to them, why would the media owner pay for it? So it's really hard to say. Currency. Now, to the idea of what a currency is and how currencies will evolve, this is the logo of this entity that oversees the definition of a meter and a kilogram. So you only need a currency if you have a standardized measure. And I think we could get to some really interesting debates and discussions about what exactly a currency is anyways. Sure, it's basically any standardized measure that facilitates trading. I guess that's a safe one to say. I'd argue that there usually should be a third party. It turns out that when it comes to measurement of things like kilograms and meters, it's like a governmental entity that does it. It doesn't need to be. But we really need to have a view about trading conventions first before we can have a view about how currencies will evolve. And so this goes back to the idea, well, what's the planning paradigm that's going to exist in this world that we've just laid out? If we don't have a view for what that's going to be with certainty, we can't really have a view about what the currency is going to be with a lot of certainty. We need to have a view about how trading conventions will evolve, given all of the all the stuff that we mentioned prior. The other thing we can actually be somewhat certain about is that a currency is a natural monopoly, like a utility. That is to say, you could have a second dam run by a second entity in a place. You could try to divide up the infrastructure by two different entities, but it's going to result in a lot of extra cost. And so that's another thing to think about in this world where, marketers don't want to pay extra if they can avoid it. All right. With all of that said, here are some consequences. that we can say with varying degrees of certainty. Okay, we think audiences are going to be more commonly bought over programs. Sure, I think that's pretty clear. More upfront commitments. Now, I'm arguing, especially because of the consolidation argument, the negotiating clout between sellers and buyers probably evolves, and the scarcity of television probably goes up. If television is defined in a relatively narrow way and it's still impactful, well, that means making early commitments is going to be more important. Large agencies probably continue to have an advantage when it comes to national TV in this world. Again, if there are a smaller number of sellers, that's probably the case. I bet that guarantees continue to be widely relied upon, in part because of the scarcity of inventory. I think many marketers will continue to rely on age and gender, in part because outcomes as a concept is imperfect, as age and gender are. And if you believe that in national television, the marketers who tend to want to use it tend to want to reach everybody, age and gender is just a proxy for a certain kind of programming anyways. You care about reaching everyone for the most part when you're using television. Frankenmetrics as a concept, I think it's just going to be increasingly relied upon. The fact that you'll want to combine different data that probably should never be combined. I think that only becomes more common in this world. And I do think that Nielsen is durable. And I also think that there can be opportunities for independent providers of measurement and currency. Now, I think the big issue is the money there for the independent or the emerging players. That part, I guess, remains to be seen. But I think that to the extent that they can duck and weave and find new ways to continue to support their businesses, sure, they can have opportunities too. But I think that all these things can be true at the same time. I think that's about it. Great. Thank you.
So Brian's brief was to be a little bit provocative and very insightful. And I have to say, I think you delivered in spades.
Thank you.
We do have a panel who's going to talk a bit about the future. But before we go to that, we have a couple of minutes to take questions, comments, possibly mild heckles from anyone. Does anyone want to comment or ask a question to Brian about anything you've just heard? We have a couple of minutes if anybody would. Just stick your hand up. There is a mic somewhere. Where's the mic? Where's the mic? I believe there's one somewhere. Any questions? Is everybody completely floored? Guys?
Using a Nielsen metric and a first-party metric to identify an audience.
Thank you, Chris. Any other questions, clarifying or otherwise? We have one over here. Let's see.
About audience, like planning based on audience, and then your one point talked about it, you can handle it was still there. That at the end of the day, it's audience really.
Well, when I say audience, I mean advanced audiences or whatever term you want to use for it. It's funny. I always just I was at Simul Media, some people know, and I always just think of audiences in a very maybe slightly different way. But no, when I say audiences, I mean like the idea of like auto intenders. I think that no question, there will be some marketers, it'll be probably a minority of national TV buyers who want those advanced audiences that are not age and gender based. But age and gender was never a perfect metric. It's just a convention. It facilitates comparisons. So I think that's why it persists.
Any other questions, comments? One over here. Howard.
Yeah, I think that a marketer who wants what addressable TV does can accomplish the same goal probably more cost effectively and with a better return path, doing it in, on digital platforms. I think that the number of advertisers who want to do what addressable advertising facilitates, like supporting building a big brand and trying to send just a single message to a small number of people, there's just better alternatives. That doesn't mean there's not a niche opportunity, right? It's just to say, I mean, obviously I've been paying attention to this for over 20 years, and I think this is the main reason why it never really became a big thing. I do think that a good niche case would be politicians trying to do, zip code level ads. Clearly, it's a huge opportunity for that, right? Or if you say that, well, yeah, we think we can persuade this person to come out to vote, so that kind of addressability, sure. But I think it is and will remain a very small part of the overall TV industry. It's not a salvation.
Okay, provocative indeed. Any other questions? We'll probably do one more before we bring our panel up. Final question from anyone? Got one over there.
How do you see the quality of men playing into possible changes?
Oh,
Well, it's really better. That how
I think I would hold the view that no measurement will be perfect. And I think that if you have incrementally better measurement, that's probably not enough to change anything else. I mean, incrementally better measurement that's dramatically more expensive loses. Imperfect measurement that more or less satisfies a reasonably credible benchmark, it's reasonably well put together, I think that wins.
Hear, hear. Well, a massive thank you to Brian.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.